David Lévy est chercheur actuellement à Oxford et en particulier il est directeur du Reuters Institute for Study of Journalism, qui est principalement un centre d'études et de recherche, d'études appliquées et puis de recherche académique sur le journalisme et sur les médias. Il s'intéresse aussi beaucoup à Internet. Alors, David a fait sa thèse à Nuffield College à Oxford sur le Front populaire à Marseille, donc il connaît très bien la France. Il a été administrateur de France 24, qui est une chaîne de télévision, administrateur non exécutif, c'est bien ça. Il est à l'Ofcom, qui est en Grande-Bretagne l'office de régulation pour la radio et la télévision, c'est bien ça. Et puis, il a été dans la commission COPé pour discuter, parce qu'il a été donc journaliste à la BBC, hein, donc pour celles et ceux d'entre vous qui sont journalistes ou étudiants en journalisme, c'est un confrère. Et il a été journaliste à la BBC, ensuite il a été l'un des directeurs de la BBC, chargé de s'occuper des problèmes de service public. Donc il connaît très bien les problèmes de radio et télévision de service public. En Grande-Bretagne, vous avez la BBC d'une part et Channel 4 d'autre part, la quatrième chaîne, qui sont les chaînes de service public. Voilà, je crois que je vais te laisser la parole, David.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Baptiste. Would you like me to stand up, or are you happy if I sit down? Okay, I'll sit down. As you can realize, I'm going to speak in English, but I'm told that you all understand English perfectly, so this will pose no problem.
Je pourrais traduire certaines questions.
Oui, de toute façon, pour les questions, je peux prendre des questions en français, mais I will respond in English. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a great honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here at the beginning of your university year. I should just say, Jean-Baptiste said I was a member of the COPE Commission, but I should just say that I was an independent member, and you should read nothing political into the fact that I was a member of that commission. I was there because there was an interest in knowing how the BBC worked, and so I was there as an expert on the BBC, which, as you know, the BBC in Britain is a public service broadcaster, but it takes no advertising. So some of you will see the connection as to why there was an interest in the BBC. I run this thing called the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, and that's an organisation which brings mid-career journalists to Oxford from around the world, all over the world, to become even better journalists than they already are. And we also do a lot of research, and we're a think tank producing what I think are interesting things about the future of journalism. And if you look at our website, if you just search on Google for Reuters Institute, you'll find our website, and you'll find a lot of information there. And what I'm going to talk about today is what I see as both the threats and the opportunities for the future of journalism. And I'm going to talk about three different dimensions there. I'm going to start by saying why I think journalism matters. I suspect I don't need to persuade you of why journalism matters, but I will explain why I think it matters. I'm then going to talk about the threats and opportunities along three different angles. Firstly, how consumer behaviour is changing. Secondly, how journalism itself is changing. I'll spend less time on that because that's what you all know about and what you're working on here. And lastly, I'll talk about the business and the economics of journalism and how that's changing. And then I'll say, what's the balance sheet between the threats and the opportunities? What I'm going to draw on for most of what I'm going to talk about is two big projects that we've been doing at the Reuters Institute. One is called The Changing Business of Journalism, and that will produce a report which we will publish in October, and I'll use some of that material today. And the other is what's called the Reuters Institute Digital Report, which is a report looking at consumer behaviour in 5 countries, including France. And you can find all the information for that on our website. So firstly, why does journalism matter? I obviously run an institute for the study of journalism, so of course I think it matters, but I suppose I would argue that journalism matters more than some other industries or other professional sectors. And I think journalism matters fundamentally because of the first thing here, because journalism matters to democracy. It matters to democracy in three ways, I think. It matters because it provides public information so people can know what's going on. It should help public understanding so they understand why what's going on matters. And when it works well, it should hold power to account. It doesn't always work well all the time in every country, but that, I'd say, is the ideal of what journalism should be doing and to matter. Now, I think if you want that kind of journalism and in any society, there are some things you need within the profession and some things that you need from outside the profession. The things you need within the profession are what I call the essential ingredients. I think you need skepticism. You need always to be skeptical of your sources and what they tell you. You should never, it's a sort of standard thing, and I don't know how it is in what you're trained, but in the BBC I was always trained, always use 2 or 3 sources before you say anything. That's getting harder now because sometimes they're the same source recycled. But you need skepticism about your sources. You need to be really determined in the way you scrutinize and examine a story, and persistent in terms of trying to find out the truth. And the last thing I'd say is you really need to have a commitment to truthfulness and accuracy. If you don't want to do that, then I'd say you're not really a journalist, you're maybe doing something else. But you may be not a journalist who is meeting some of the needs, some of the democratic needs, I would say, that I've said about in the first point. Now, it's not good enough to be doing these things. If your journalism is to matter, I think you need 2 other things as well. I think you need a level of independence. Now, everybody thinks of editorial independence, of saying, how am I, if I work for France Télévisions, am I independent of the government? Or if I work for the BBC, am I independent of the government? But the editorial independence is also a state of mind about a commitment to trying to tell the truth and be fair. But also, increasingly, you need economic independence. You need to feel that you can say what you believe to be true without your employer saying they fear the government complaining, or saying we fear that this advertiser will withdraw their advertising. So you really need independence, which is both editorial and economic. And I think you need impact as well. If you want journalism to matter, then you must say that the journalism you do has some impact. Now, that impact can be 2 different kinds. It can be impact on a small group of elite decision makers, or it can be impact on a mass audience. Whichever it is, the journalism, if you're going to do journalism that contributes to democracy, it needs to have some kind of impact, as well as meeting the other things I've outlined here. Let me move on. So, threats and opportunities. I'm going to firstly about the opportunities, and this is my short commercial for this digital news report, which I mentioned, which is on our website. And the methodology for that, it's an online survey that we did in 5 countries, a larger survey in the UK of about 2,000 people, and a survey of roughly 1,000 other people in the US, France, Germany, and Denmark. In the UK, we boosted it with some people who use tablets as their main way of getting news. Let me pick out a few themes about the way consumer behaviour is changing and where I think this presents challenges and opportunities for journalists. So firstly, we asked a question, which of the following news sources have you used in the past week? Television, online, print, radio. And the striking thing that you see across all the countries we looked at is the red bar, which is online, the web, is pretty close to the traditionally sort of dominant bar, which is television. So you see in the UK, more people use online in the last week than television, the same in the US, the same in Denmark, and in France, they're just about equal, online and television. I'm not going to show you it here, but if in the UK and in other countries we have the data for younger people, and of course you won't be surprised to know that this is the whole population, but as you go down the age group, young people depend more on online and less on television than the population as a whole. If we then focus in on online and say what kind of sources of news do you use when you are online, we get quite an interesting picture. We offer people a choice, saying, when you get news online, where does that news come from? Does it come from broadcasters' websites, if you look down the left side, from newspapers, from other news sources, or from social media? And what you see is, you see that in the UK, the largest number of people get their online news from a broadcaster. And that essentially is about the BBC's website, which is a very, very important source of news in the UK. So that's the top left-hand box there of the UK. 56% of people get their news online from a broadcaster, which is basically the BBC. If you look in Germany, you find very few people get their news from broadcasters. And there's quite a simple reason for that. They're online news from broadcasters. There's a simple reason, which is German public broadcasters have not been allowed to provide what are called press-like services online. So there's not much choice. If you look in France, which I guess will probably interest you most, you find very few people getting their online news from broadcasters, quite a lot getting their online news from newspapers, but quite a lot from what we call other news sources, 36%. That essentially is some of the kind of pure players in France, who are neither broadcasters or newspapers, but are online-only providers. Another thing we looked at was how people are accessing news. So we looked at, are you getting your news from television, radio, online, or the press? Then we looked at online, where do you get it from? And then we said, online, how do you get it? Do you get it on your computer, or a mobile, or a tablet device? And what's becoming clear is that more and more people are accessing news online via a mobile, and in France there's 6% accessing it at the moment via a tablet. That's lower than some of the other countries, but we expect that to increase over time as tablets get cheaper. Once again, the picture would look different if we didn't take the whole population, but just looked at a younger age group. If you're a journalist or a news organisation, one of the things that's very interesting about this is it provides new opportunities for you. So we said, and so that's why I call this online and tablets as game changers. The little circle I tried to put has ended up in the wrong place. So on the left-hand side, the circle is meant to circle The Guardian. And on the right-hand side, the Guardian newspaper as well. What's interesting is, if we ask people which newspaper they used, in our survey, 4% of people said they used the Guardian newspaper. If we look online, you see that 10% of our survey used the Guardian online. And then when we went to the tablet, we found 21% of people used the Guardian on tablets. So what you see there with those three figures, 4% in print, 10% online, 21% on tablets, is you see the opportunity for a tiny news organisation, or a relatively small one, The Guardian, to expand its impact enormously from 4% in print to 21% on the tablets. So that newspaper is using a new delivery mechanism, the tablet, new access device, as a way of completely reversing the hierarchy of who is dominant in the news business. The BBC is still the top, but on the right-hand side of the tablet, The Guardian is second. So if there's an opportunity, so I said I was talking about threats and opportunities, and I'd say that here you see an opportunity with new technology and new devices to upset traditional hierarchies within the business. Now, I talked about tablets, and so I will move on to the question about who's willing to pay for news and whether anybody pays for news. This slide is not that encouraging. We asked people, have you paid for digital news content in the last year? In the UK, the answer is 4% of people have paid something for content in the last year. In Denmark, it's 12%. France is in the middle at about 8%. And I suspect that's because maybe it's one of the benefits of the French language in this case as against the English language. In English, there is just a huge amount of free news. In France, there's a lot, but maybe less. So maybe more people are willing to pay for good news in French than maybe would in English. And you see on the left, even more are willing to pay in Danish. Now, I'm not suggesting you adopt Danish as your national language, but it may be some protection in terms of thinking about who's going to pay for news. French may be an advantage in this respect. We also asked people whether they were willing to pay for news on different devices, and these are figures for the UK only. And we found that on a computer, only 5% would say they pay for news online. As I've said, there's a huge amount of news available in English online. On a mobile phone, people are used to spending money on all kinds of things, from ringtones to SMS to other things. 12% of people said they'd pay. And on a tablet, 16% of UK respondents said they'd pay for news. Now, of course, at the moment, people who have tablets like iPads tend to be richer people. They've got more money to spend, they're more willing to pay for things. But it's also true when we ask people about the experience of looking at news on a tablet, the vast majority said it was a much, much better experience. So the figures are partly that these people are richer, but it's also because looking at news on a tablet is a better experience than looking at it on a mobile or a computer. So I've looked at the way people get their news. I've looked at whether they're willing to pay. But I suppose the other thing that's interesting is if you look at what's happening online, one of the things our survey looks at how many more people are sharing news and participating in news. And we gave people a whole range of ways in which they might share and participate in news. And we found the figures that we did this survey in April, which is an important point, but we found about 60% of people in France who responded to the survey were participating or sharing news in some way or other. I'll show you what ways we were thinking of there, and you see the figures for the other countries. France was the highest country there, other than the USA. This is important for you as journalists and would-be journalists. If you're thinking about your relation with the audience and your relationship with the people who are going to read your content, is that they're not just going to read it. Increasingly, they want to interact with it, and they want to share it in some way. This slide basically gives the range of different ways in which we asked people how they might share or interact with news. Now, I said we did the survey in April, and that's obviously an important point for France, because you see, in France, there were 40% of people who said they'd voted in an online poll, and as you all know, April was the time of your presidential elections, so it's reasonable to assume that more people might have been engaged with responding to news stories about politics and other things in April than maybe if we'd done our survey in February or January or last year. But you see here a whole range of ways in which people might respond or participate. Voting in a poll, commenting on a news story, having a conversation with people, commenting on a story, or posting or responding in some way to a story. The USA is the country that has the highest rates of participation. And in this respect, not in every respect, but in this respect, I think the USA will probably be a model that other countries will follow. Now, I'm just going to end this section talking about consumer behavior and how that's changing and the threats and opportunities with a few kind of observations trying to pull this together. I suppose the positive side and the dramatic side is that lots of people talk about the problems facing journalism and the problems facing news, but right now there are more people accessing more news than ever before. So if you're a journalist, you're in an industry where there's a huge demand for your product. That's good news. They're not just more people accessing more news, but they're accessing it through more devices and from more different providers. That's a bit difficult. It means there's more competition. And they're finding that news in new ways. Social media, not just search. One of the things I haven't talked about is when we ask people how they found news stories, social media in several organisations in the UK is almost as important as search. So in other words, Facebook is almost as important a place to find a news story for some people as is Google. And then, as I've said, there's more feedback, there's more interaction, there's more people contributing to news. That's all the changes that are going on, or many of them. But one also needs to be aware of the continuities. I've said that online is used much more, but if you ask people, not a story, not the question, where did you get your news from last week, but which source of news do you rely on most? Every country I know of, the answer is still television. That the majority of people rely most on television and see that as the most important source of news. So people are looking at online several times a day, but if you ask the population at large, which is the most important source, they say television. The other thing that's important in terms of continuity is who generates the stories. Where is reporting done? And all the figures I've seen say that most stories, in spite of the fragmentation and changes in the industry, most news stories are still generated by journalists working for the printed press. I'll give you a couple of figures here. If we look at Finland and the US, they're two countries we look at in this survey we're doing, 60% of all journalists are employed by the printed press in those two countries. If we look at Britain, the UK, in spite of the BBC, 80% of journalists in Britain work for newspapers. So there are lots of problems facing newspapers, which I'll come on to, but it's just well worth being aware that they are still, as far as in all the figures I've seen, the largest source of employment for journalists and often the largest source of the generation of original news stories. So there's a bit of a problem there because they come up quite low in terms of how often people access things and so on. So I said I was going to talk about three things: consumer behaviour, journalism practice and business models. Let me move on to journalism practice. And as I've said, I will spend very little time on this. I'll just do 3 slides on this because this is what you do here, and there's many people in the room who know as much and much more than I do about this. The theme of the talk is threats and opportunities, so let me talk about opportunities, and then I call the second one challenges rather than threats here. The internet, the web, they transform journalism in a whole lot of ways. It means research is much easier. It means you can find information in real time. 30 years ago, if you wanted to know what the president said at his press conference, you had to send a journalist to the Elysee. Not many people do that anymore. You can look at it online, you can look at it on television. It means there's whole new ways of finding new sources of news, and there's new ways that your readers will discover and distribute your news and feedback and participate in it. There's also the rise of what, I don't know what it's called here, but in Britain is called networked journalism, this interaction between the journalist and their reader, where you get the reader to contribute or actually help you write a story. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in a minute. But I also think it means that you as journalists have to raise your game. You have to do something better than you would have done years ago. Telling us what the president said at his press conference yesterday afternoon at 5 o'clock is no good this morning. We all know that. You've got to add something to it. You've got to do something better. I also think the opportunity is that news organisations are going to be changing the way they think about news. And I've said here, maybe cruelly, that maybe this is an overdue challenge to complacent news organisations. There's an opportunity here to shake up everything in news organisations. And that gives great opportunities to you as new people coming into this industry with new ideas, because increasingly every news organisation recognises the way they always did things is no longer the way they should always be. The challenges, or the threats on the other side, are many. There's a British journalist called Nick Davis, who writes for the Guardian newspaper, who wrote a book called Flat Earth News. It was basically an investigation into journalism itself. And he coined this term, what he calls churnalism, the idea that journalists, many journalists in many news organisations, are not finding out news stories, they are just churning and recycling press releases. That's what he meant when he talked about journalism. Not a very flattering term, but that's what he meant. It's a good book called Flat Earth News. It's about 3 or 4 years old now. Another challenge is Is hard news losing out to the press release and the journalists reading the press release and public relations material rather than finding out news for themselves? A third challenge is, here this is a publication we at the Reuters Institute did a few years ago, where we said, is there a danger, I don't know what a windsock is in French, what is it? It's something you have at an airfield. Come on? Okay, thank you. It's a thing you have at an airfield that shows you which way the wind is blowing. And the argument in this piece that we published was news organisations increasingly at risk of seeing which way the customer's going and just saying, let's do more stories like that. The news organisations are becoming a windsock following the story rather than something else which is trying to lead the agenda. And of course that's helped by what I call here instant measurement and the rise of the click stream. If you go and work in an online newspaper or news organisation now, your employer knows instantly how many people are reading your story, how many clicks there are on it, how long they spend on your story. It's great for monitoring productivity. Is it great for managing original news gathering? I dare say, if you wrote a story about Carla Bruni, you'd probably get more clicks than if you wrote a story about Francois Hollande. I don't know. You have to decide what you think about journalistic values versus the values demonstrated by how often people click on your story, the click stream. I think the challenge as well, and its point about raising your game, is the basic news, the basic journalistic questions. Who did it? What did they do? And where? Those old questions. Who, what, where? They don't have much value anymore. That's commoditized news. So you need to add value, as I've said. And at the same time, the challenge for many news organisations is doing all this whilst doing more with fewer staff and less cash. It's tough, but I think, as I said, I think you have a great opportunity because every news organisation I know, all the bosses are struggling with understanding the young audience and wanting to know what's going on. And they're all crying out for people who actually live on Facebook rather than live with their face buried in the newspaper. I'm going to give you two examples of how news and how journalism is changing. And they're just two little stories I'm going to tell you from British newspapers from a couple of years ago. I call this the survival of the scoop. This story is an old-fashioned journalistic scoop. The Daily Telegraph in 2009. Daily Telegraph is a big, successful newspaper in Britain, makes money, it's right of centre in its politics. Maybe the Figaro is the closest equivalent in France, I'm not sure. But maybe what I'm about to tell you is not a very close equivalent. There was a scandal about members of Parliament and their expenses. Somebody approached the Daily Telegraph and said, I have a lot of information on this, and I will sell you this CD with all the information about every member of Parliament's expenses. The Telegraph paid the money, £110,000. It bought the CD, and then every day for a month, the Telegraph published a story about a group of members of Parliament. Here's one story from one day. And they went through every member of Parliament and they published the headlines. For every day, for 30 days, there was another story. And nobody knew until midnight which MP was next in the firing line. It was a pretty trying time, if you remember, at Parliament. And the result was Parliament and the government changed all the rules about members of Parliament's expenses. So I say it's an old-fashioned scoop with the addition of some money being paid for the CD. The Guardian newspaper did something different at the same time. I call this citizen journalism harnessed by mainstream media. The Guardian is a left-of-centre newspaper. They said, the Telegraph's done a great job here. If you approve of the ethics, we could debate that in questions. But they said, the Telegraph's done a good job. How do we add any value to this? And they said, well, actually, there's thousands of pages of detail here. We don't have enough journalists to look at all of this. We put up the 40,000 pages of information on our website, and we're going to create a competition for our readers to analyse all these expenses. Now, each reader, or all those readers together, understood more about each of these expense receipts than any journalist in London could ever do, because obviously every reader was interested in what their own Member of Parliament had done, and they knew where the receipt came from, they knew the name of the shop, and so the combination of all the Guardian's readers collaborating to analyse these 40,000 pages of PDF documents meant the Guardian then produced another whole lot of stories. So it's a way the Guardian added value when it hadn't got the scoop. And it added value by doing what we call citizen or networked journalism. Okay, so I've talked about consumer behaviour, I've talked about some changes in journalism, but just a few. And I'm just going to go on to talk about the business models, the economics. And this is the toughest part of the talk, I'm afraid. So there are increasingly grounds for concern about who's going to pay for news, or how does news get paid for? How are your salaries going to get paid in the organisations you go to work with? And here, there's a problem of fragmentation of audiences, fragmentation of people's attention, and fragmentation of money, of revenues. Now, obviously I come from Britain, and in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's an assumption that everything that's going on is going to follow the American model. And the American model is essentially one where the internet appears to have caused quite a lot of damage to a lot of newspapers. I'd argue that actually that's not what's happening, and in the American case there are some very exceptional circumstances. Two of them are that American newspapers historically depended for 80 or 90% of their revenues on advertising, not on sales to ordinary people. And the second is that in America, most newspapers are local and they're dependent on local advertising. And local advertising in America has gone to the internet. So American newspapers suffered twice. The advertising went to the internet, and they suffered twice because they were very dependent on advertising. They suffered from a downturn in the economy and the advertising going to the internet. What I'd argue is that there are lots of differences between different news industries, and some of the problems are cyclical. They're about the economic cycle, not about the internet particularly. If we look here, and this is this 8-country study we're doing, and just look at how many newspapers are sold per 1,000 population, we see here that there's a huge variation between the number of copies sold. This is looking at figures from 2000 to 2009. I'm going to show you 3 slides on this. In Finland, the figure at the line at the top. So Finland's right at the top up there, and they used to have about 450 newspapers bought for every 1,000 people. Now Finland's gone down by 14%, and it's there over on the right. And in fact, if you look at the developed countries, the mature economies, if you look at Finland, France, Germany, Italy, UK and US, everybody's declining by different amounts, but they're declining from very different levels here. The one exception is India. India starts at a very low level here, starts here, and the number of newspapers sold per person in India now is increased and has actually overtaken Italy, which is this orange line here. So what I'm trying to show you here is not just that there's problems of decline in everywhere except India, but also that the point at which you start is really, really important. So Finland started really high. Finland's declining pretty much the same amount as France, but at Finland's current rate of decline, it would take 70 years before Finland reaches the level that France is at today. So 2 mature democracies, mature newspaper markets, but you see the French newspaper market is operating at a much lower level, sorry, France is there, than many others, than Germany or Finland. So when people talk about the crisis of the internet affecting newspapers, the first question to ask is, well, where did we start from? How healthy did we look before all this was happening? And the answer is lots of different things happening in different places. And then if people say to you, newspapers are suffering everywhere, just think about India, 64% increase in the last year, in the last 10 years. And this slide basically says how many internet users are there as a percent of population. And once again, we see the top line at the top, that brownish, reddish line at the top, is Finland. So if people say to you the internet is killing newspapers, you need to ask yourself, how is it that the country that has more newspapers sold per population than any other also has the highest level of internet penetration? Over 80% of people have internet in Finland, and about 50% of people in Finland, 45% of people pay for a newspaper every day. So what's going on is more complicated. There are challenges, but they're quite complicated challenges. I think there are also some opportunities here. As I said before, there's bigger audiences than ever for news. Any industry is welcome to the fact if you've got people that want to use your product. It's also easier for new entrants to come in. Distribution is easier than ever before. And if you look at things like the Huffington Post, which I gather are set up here in France, if you look at Mediapart, Rue 89, Agoravox, some of the pure players here in France, all of these people could not have started before the age of the internet. I think there's also an opportunity. I think if you're a niche producer and you produce a niche product that everybody has to have, then you can have a real success. And as I said before, you can reverse the traditional hierarchies. This is a moment where everything is up for grabs. The industry is in a difficult position, but don't assume that the old established players are always going to be in a powerful position. I'm going to give you 3 stories about different British online players and try and draw a few conclusions from them. Who's heard the word freemium, the thing I've got here under the Financial Times thing? Has anybody heard that word? No. Okay, you know what a premium product is. You only get it if you pay for it. Okay? So in Britain, the Times newspaper online is a premium product. You get no access to the Times if you don't pay their subscription. The result is the Times doesn't show up in very many social media recommendations, because when it does, people can't access the stories. The Financial Times here on the left. Financial Times has decided they've set up what they call a freemium model, or what people in the industry are calling that. You get some stuff for free, but then you have to pay for everything. I think that's the model that Le Monde uses, basically, judging by when I look at their site. You can look at a certain amount for free, but if you want everything, you pay. Financial Times, you get, I think, 10 or 20 stories a month, but then you have to pay. Now look down the left-hand side. The Financial Times is interesting because it's a small newspaper by British standards, but it's a global newspaper. It has a paid circulation of 600,000 copies, or people. But this year, something dramatic happened in the Financial Times. More people started paying for its digital edition than its print edition. 301,000 in digital, 297 in print. It's the first newspaper I'm aware of where the number of paying customers, not just users, but paying customers in digital exceeds the numbers in print. And you see the Financial Times has a huge number of people registered or using apps on their iPads. It's the single most expensive newspaper in Britain. It sells at £2.50 a copy. That's about €3 every day, and that makes it a very expensive newspaper in Britain. But it's a newspaper which has a digital strategy that's working. It's a small newspaper, very tightly focused. If you look at The Guardian, you see something very different. Has anybody here ever looked at the Guardian website? Has anybody ever looked at it? Okay. Well, I think there's one person here that put their hand up that I saw who said they looked at the Guardian website. The interesting thing, if you're an English language newspaper, the internet gives you opportunities of reaching a global audience in a way, and particularly an American audience, that you could never have reached before. And this applies to all the cases I'm going to talk about. The Guardian newspaper has revenues of about £200 million, but of those, only about 46 million come from digital, and of that, only about 15 million comes from people paying for advertising online. The rest of the digital income is from dating. The Guardian has a very successful site called Soulmates, and Guardian readers seem to like to find out about each other, and that's a very profitable digital sideline. But advertising alongside news doesn't produce that much money. Its audience online is racing ahead, 38% increase last year, but as you see down before, the losses of the Guardian Media Group are also racing ahead. £44 million they lost last year, and that's more than they lost the year before. And the question is, when can they stop? When can they go, how long can they afford to go on losing that amount of money? The Guardian's in a game of what we in English would call double or quits. You spend more money on digital and you hope that the money will come good. But in the meantime, you're putting more and more money in and the profits are not coming back. The Guardian maybe hopes that it will be like another newspaper, only in the respect of the business model. The Guardian sells at £1.20 in Britain, that's about €1.50. The Daily Mail, has anybody ever read the Daily Mail? Or seen the Daily Mail? Yes, okay. The Daily Mail is a British tabloid newspaper. It's a mid-market newspaper, right of centre, and it's probably one of the most profitable newspapers in Britain. If you look at the Daily Mail website, it's rather different from the Daily Mail newspaper. Much, much more sensational. More what you call here people press, showbiz stories, sensational stories about showbiz personalities, and also news. The Daily Mail has an online website which is now the world's most popular website anywhere. And that basically means it's dominating the American market. The Daily Mail in America has more people using its website than the New York Times. By a small margin, but they're ahead of the New York Times. They have a rather different editorial strategy to the New York Times, as you will have realised. The New York Times, very sober, straight newspaper. The Daily Mail online is not very sober. So they had 45 million monthly users in January of this year, just ahead of the New York Times. But the challenge is that what's happening on the revenues front. In 2010-11, the Daily Mail made £16 million out of its website. This year, it's predicted to make £27 million out of its website. But the print edition, the point I've got here in red, the Daily Mail, the old-fashioned newspaper, made £700 million last year. So you've got this paradox. It's the most successful newspaper website that I'm aware of in the world, but its revenues are a small percentage in the website of its print revenues. And the Daily Mail runs Metro newspaper, a free newspaper in London and the UK. That newspaper made £80 million last year from 1 million readers. So you see this huge disproportion between the size of the audience online and the size of the revenues online as against offline. I'm going to try and bring all this together and summarise what I think are the balance of the threats and opportunities. And as you remember, I've talked about why journalism matters, I've talked about what's changing in consumer behaviour, what's changing in journalism practice, and what's changing in business models. So let's start first with the good news. There are great opportunities in journalism. The changes I talked about in consumer behaviour, you've got more readers, you've got more engagement, and you've got more people responding to what you've done than ever before. This is a great success story. It's a great opportunity. In journalism as well, I think there's an opportunity, and it's going on at the moment, for a creative renaissance, for things to change dramatically. There's a chance to experiment. There's a chance to have a less hierarchical industry where age and experience are no longer valued as much as youth and novelty. Good news for you. When it comes to business models, there's a chance for the pure players that I talked about, some of the online-only news providers, the Huffington Post, Mediapart, Bouquet-Pavaneur. They've got great chances. They couldn't have done this before. If you're blessed with the English language, you've got the chance of a global English. If you've got French, you can reach more people than you could have reached before, but you're limited to a Francophone audience. You can get a global audience. And if you're a niche player like the Financial Times, you can do really well. There's a great business opportunity there. What are the threats? What are the balances against this? If you look at the consumer behaviour, I think the balance sheet is positive. There are negatives. People have got less time. They give less attention to your stories. You have to struggle to keep up with the consumer. You have to be on every platform and every device. That costs money to chase the consumer. But on balance, I think what's changing is really positive for journalism. In terms of journalism, you've got less time and less money to basically do better stories than you would have done 20 or 30 years ago. You've got to do more and produce a better experience with less resources. It's challenging, but I still think it's a positive story. When it comes to the business and the economics, I think there's a challenge, there's a contrast between what the Americans call digital cents versus print dollars. And this is my point about what I showed about the internet, is that people are getting huge audiences online, but they're getting relatively small revenues from advertising. If you can get a subscription model that works, it's okay. I think the story is online, it's quite hard for general news at the moment. It's quite hard if you don't have if you don't have a very specific and targeted product, or if you can't persuade your readers to pay for your product. I think in America there's been a lot of success stories about pure players, online-only players succeeding. They have two benefits in America. They have a market of 310 million people, as against European markets and big countries of 50 to 70 million, 50 to 80 million if you include Germany. So they have a really big market, and they also have a lot of foundations that are funding this kind of journalism. It's harder if you're a European pure player to reach break-even point. I'd be interested to know what some of you think about some of the French experiences in terms of the pure players, and how optimistic you are about whether they're going to survive. So I suppose, in summary, I'd say this is a time of experimentation in all these three areas: consumer behaviour, journalism, and business models. I think the first two are really positive. I think in business models, people are still trying to find the right answers. It's a challenging time, but it's also a time where there's, as I said, there's experimentation going on. Every day, every week, people learn from somebody else's experience. So I'm not pessimistic. On balance, I'd say the opportunities outweigh the threats, but it's going to be quite a bumpy ride for the next few years. But I think you're in a really good place to ride that challenge, because you're blessed with the ability to experiment and think of new approaches. And as I say, most people at my age in the industry think the way we always did it is the only way to do it. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
David, for your very interesting speech. Merci beaucoup, David. La conférence si intéressante. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Questions from the floor?
Vous pouvez poser les questions en français.
Oui. Oui. Si.
Oui, il y en a une là-bas.
Oui.
Hop, levez-vous peut-être.
Non.
Non, pourquoi?
Dans la première partie, vous avez dit plusieurs critères. Vous disiez qu'un journal comptait. Et vous avez dit dans un premier temps que c'était son indépendance et qu'après c'était son impact.
Oui.
D'abord, qu'est-ce que vous appelez impact? Est-ce que c'est le nombre de ventes? Du coup, vous jugez qu'un journal compte plus qu'un autre s'ils ont plus de numéros chaque jour ou chaque semaine. Et surtout, vous n'avez pas parlé de contenu. Donc pour vous, en fait, le contenu d'un journal n'influence pas son importance dans l'ensemble des journaux.
Okay, it's a very good question. In terms of, I didn't talk much about content, but I suppose the message I was trying to get across was to say that doing great journalism is important, but it's not enough. And that I think you then need to say, who's using my journalism? Who's reading it? What impact does it have? That leads to your second question, which is, how do you measure impact? What do I mean by that? Is it the number of sales or what? Yeah? And what I would say is, you need, there are lots of different ways of measuring impact. Sometimes you can have a lot of people talking about a story, even when not many people bought the newspaper. So I think these things can vary, but I suppose what I'm saying is, if you're in the business of journalism, if you want to be a good journalist and have a lot of impact, you need to find some way of making sure that a lot of people read your stuff or know about it or talk about it. I just think doing fantastic journalism isn't enough. I think you need to think about the impact. Have I answered your question or not? Not enough. Yeah? Yeah. It's interesting, at the Reuters Institute in Oxford, we have journalists who come from all over the world, and they all write a memoir when they're with us, a research paper. And they all, when they've done it, they do really good papers. But at the end of it, I say to them, okay, when you write for your newspaper, normally the newspaper markets your story. Now you've written something for us. You are the person that has to market your story. The same will apply to your memoir here. You really need to think about how do you get people to pay attention to what you've written. If you think you've done something good, you need to find a way of promoting it. And I suppose what I'm saying is, I think as journalists, everybody now needs to think about how do I get people to talk about my story? If I've done something good, how do I promote it? How do I get attention for it? And I think it's an aspect of journalism that becomes more and more important with every year.
D'autres questions? Oui, mademoiselle.
Pour reprendre un peu le même thème, qu'est-ce que vous pensez du fait que des doutes sur l'indépendance d'un journal peut justement avoir effet sur l'impact qu'il a auprès du public? On a entendu ces derniers temps, notamment avec les Inrock, un gros conflit d'intérêts à la tête des Inrock. Et justement, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la part que ça a un peu dans l'inconscient collectif sur l'impact d'un journal?
Je ne connais pas le cas de l'Inrock. Est-ce que vous pouvez me dire un peu plus sur quelle est la situation là-bas?
Ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'en fait, en gros, le propriétaire du journal, c'est Mathieu Pigas, qui est aussi à la tête de la Banque Lazare, et qu'il vient de nommer Audrey Pulvar à la tête de la rédaction des Inrock, qui est également la compagne du ministre de François Hollande.
Comment?
C'est aussi la compagne d'un ministre de François Hollande.
Okay. Thank you for telling me about the details. I think I will not talk about the case because I don't know about it. But the general point that you raise, yeah, the general point about perceptions of impact, the perceptions of independence. I mean, personally, I think news organisations need to be quite strict about the relations between journalists and the people they're writing about, whether that's people in industry or people in politics. And I think the risk, I think there's two risks of not doing that. One is an ethical risk, and that comes down to your conscience and your personal reputation. But the other is a kind of market risk. And I don't know what's happened in the case you're talking about, but I think the danger is if people suspect that your journalism is influenced by the people you are close to or the people that you're dependent on, they will stop reading your newspaper. But has that happened in the case you're talking about or not?
Est-ce qu'il y a eu une baisse d'audience des Inrock?
C'est tout nouveau. Hein.
C'est tout nouveau, d'accord, donc c'est trop tôt pour savoir.
Peut-être vous pouvez nous dire, parce que l'année dernière en Grande-Bretagne, il y a eu un gros scandale avec News of the World, qui appartient à Rupert Murdoch. On a découvert que les journalistes avaient écouté les messageries téléphoniques de nombreuses personnes pour obtenir des scoops. News of the World a dû fermer. Hein. Oui. Est-ce que les journaux aujourd'hui du groupe de Murdoch, de Rupert Murdoch, hein, qui appartenait au même groupe où il y avait News of the World, perdent des lecteurs, donc de l'impact en fait?
Did everybody hear that? Okay, Alexandre Jou asked me a question about how does this apply in the United Kingdom, where the News of the World had been involved in hacking people's phones and listening to people's phones. It's an interesting case. I mean, Britain in the last year has had the worst scandal affecting journalism ethics for 50 years. And currently there is a judge who's been having an inquiry into press ethics and independence in Britain, who has called almost every senior person to give evidence, from Rupert Murdoch to Tony Blair. They have all been in front of this judge and have given evidence. So it's been a kind of big sort of psychodrama in terms of British press, linked to journalism ethics. The first thing that happened is that the newspaper that was at the centre of this scandal, the News of the World, which was the biggest selling newspaper in Britain, and had been going for more than 150 years, the proprietor closed the newspaper. It was a newspaper that made money, a lot of money. But the reason he closed it was that when this scandal broke, all the advertisers, the big names who were due to put their adverts in the newspaper for the next Sunday, they all cancelled, one after another after another. So it was a way of him saying that he was really sorry to close the newspaper, but it made good business sense, because the advertisers no longer wanted to be associated with a newspaper that suddenly the public had said what this newspaper did was unacceptable. Just one detail about that, the ethics of that case. It was a newspaper that had listened to lots of people's mobile phone messages. People like Hugh Grant and other famous showbiz personalities. When it was just showbiz personalities, the British public didn't really talk about it. The thing that caused the scandal was that they had also, it appeared, listened to the phone messages of a little girl who had been abducted and killed at the same time as the newspaper was running a campaign to find her killers. And the public were more scandalised in Britain by what they saw as the hypocrisy of the newspaper towards an ordinary member of the public than they were about the fact that they listened to the phone messages of Hugh Grant, and I could go on with a long list of other showbiz personalities. So I think, as I say, ethics are about two things. They're about what you feel good about in your head, but there is also a commercial dimension to it. And I think the British case, the News of the World case, where the advertisers all cancelled their advertising, is quite a good example of what you talk about.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Peut-être une dernière question pour sortir des contenus, etc. Est-ce que finalement l'avenir de la presse qui va sur le net, c'est pas de recruter des spécialistes des systèmes d'information pour gérer le freemium, c'est-à-dire repérer les gros lecteurs et les faire payer, pour gérer aussi le taux de clic et mieux vendre la publicité, puisqu'elle est mal valorisée sur Internet, elle est bien valorisée dans la presse. Donc est-ce que finalement les journaux n'ont pas besoin d'ingénieurs?
The question was whether the newspapers really need engineers. I suppose you meant engineers and not journalists. I think the most successful digital journalists that I now know are both at the same time. They are technically literate, they know about technology, they know about how to monetize news, they know about how to count the clickstream, and they're very good journalists. And so I think, I said before, I think as journalists you need to kind of do more, but I think you need to be technically literate. There used to be a time, and you also need to be commercially literate. There used to be a time where journalists took no interest in advertisers or in technology. I think now if you're a journalist you need to have an interest in advertising, but you also need to understand technology as well. But I think better to do that as a journalist than say, that's not my business, somebody over there can do it.
Une question, moi aussi. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez du succès du Huffington Post? Est-ce que c'est un success story qui est dû à la situation particulière des États-Unis, parce qu'on a un marché de 300 millions de lecteurs, d'internautes? Est-ce qu'il est transposable dans d'autres pays? La presse Internet.
The question was about the internet press. I understand the Huffington Post has started here with its editor as Anne Sinclair, so it's made a new story, I guess, but in its very beginning. I think that it's harder to have an internet-only newspaper in a country of 60 million than a country of 300 million, to state the obvious. But I think, I know Mediapar here, I think, which claims, I think, 60 or 80,000 subscribers they claim. I think probably it's hard to have an advertising-funded model like the Huffington Post here in Europe, but I think you could have a subscription-funded model if you can find enough people to subscribe and you can find a really clear identity for what you're doing. I've looked at Mediapart, and it's clear that one of their identifying features, as far as I can see, was their criticism of President Sarkozy and his government. So I suppose there's an interesting moment now as to whether they can establish an equally clear niche under a new president, which it appears they're trying to do. So I suppose the short answer to your question is I think you can succeed on the internet if you have a very clear proposition, and it's better to have a subscription model than an advertising model. An advertising model depends on huge volume, which is really hard to make into real money. But if you can get some subscription money as well, then I think you may succeed.